Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is portfolio questions, and the questions are on justice and to the law officers. Question number 1, John Wilson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when the Cabinet Secretary for Justice last met the Chief Constable of Strathclyde Police and what issues were discussed.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I have regular meetings with all the Chief Constables to discuss a range of matters, and I recently met with Chief Constable House at the Serious Organised Crime Task Force meeting on Monday, 10 September 2012.
John Wilson.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for his response. Could the Cabinet Secretary give any indication whether there has been any discussions regarding the possibility of locating the HQ for the new Scottish Police Service next to the Scottish Ground Campus at Gartcosh, which is well serviced by rail, road networks throughout Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm aware of the outstanding facility that there is at Gartcosh. The only discussions I've obviously had is that the temporary HQ will be based at Tullyallen. Longer-term decisions about the HQ and the location of other parts of the police service, whether on one site or dispersed around the country, as others also seek, will be for the Chief Constable to take. But I can confirm that in principle the Scottish Crime Campus would provide a purpose-built national facility for the Police Service of Scotland and its partner agencies.
David McLetchie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary read the report in relation to Strathclyde Police Authority published earlier and the inadequate level of engagement on the part of authority members, which was highlighted in that report by the Auditor.
Well, I met with Police Board conveners earlier today, and Philip Bratt, the new convener of Strathclyde Police, was there. What I can say is obviously there's matters, and that's why we carry out these reviews and investigations. But certainly both Mr Bratt and indeed the other conveners were very proactive in terms of what they were seeking to do as we move towards a single service. So I think, as in all aspects of policing and indeed administration at local or national government level, there's always good room for improvement. There's always matters to be learned. But I can say that I think Philip Bratt and his colleagues are on the case of seeking to do what they can to continue to provide an outstanding police service in Strathclyde.
Question number 2, Jim Hume.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what steps it is taking to improve administrative justice.
Cabinet Secretary.
Work has started on developing a Scottish strategy for administrative justice, and I'll keep Parliament updated as this work progresses.
Jim Hume.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer. He'll be well aware of the recent report conducted by the Administrative Justice and Tribunals Councils into administrative justice within public bodies, which outlined 5 recommendations. Will the Cabinet Secretary confirm today that he will implement the recommendation to establish a housing tribunal as part of the Scottish Civil Courts review?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, some of these matters will obviously be for discussion with my colleague, the Minister responsible for housing. What I can say is that we are in regular discussions with a variety of bodies as we move towards devolution of powers over administrative justice. As has been said by myself and others in this tribunal, people or individuals in Scotland are more likely to interact with a tribunal than they are with the court system. The devolution of powers is significant. This is a matter that we have to work with a variety of agencies, with the Lord President, with the Court Service. I've been in recent communication with Richard Henderson, who's the Secretary for the Scottish Committee of the Administrative Justice Committee. So I can give him an assurance that this matter is on the case. It is very complex, given the reservation of some matters, the devolution of others, the hybrid nature of others. We do think it's, in principle, a good thing, and I think the point he makes regarding housing is something I'm sure that my colleague will be supportive and sympathetic to.
Question number 3, Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how it plans to address trends in drink driving among young drivers.
Cabinet Secretary.
On 6 September, we launched a consultation on reducing the drink driving limit in Scotland. We believe that a lower limit will help make our roads safer for all drivers, including for young and newly qualified drivers. Young and newly qualified drivers can often be hampered by a lack of driving experience and an inaccurate assessment of their level of competence. These factors can only be made worse by the effects of alcohol. We would have wanted to explore the possibility of introducing a lower limit for young and newly qualified drivers as part of our drink driving consultation, but unfortunately the UK Government rejected our request to devolve these powers within the Scotland Act 2012. We intend to approach the UK Government again to seek further powers on drink driving, such as the ability to prescribe differential drink driving limits for different types of drivers.
Mark MacDonald.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer. Recent meetings I've had with Grampian Police have suggested that there is a trend towards younger drivers being more likely to be the ones being found to be under the influence of alcohol when stopped. And I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would agree that, as well as the welcome measures that are being taken by the Government, we need to do more to reinforce the social unacceptability and indeed the dangers of drink driving to young people, particularly those who are newly qualified.
Cabinet Secretary.
Oh, absolutely. I would concur with the member in that. I think we're all aware that there are far too many tragedies in Scotland, whether rural or urban, but I do know that Grampian suffers significantly in this respect. Some of it, we believe, could be helped by a legislative change, and the reduction in the drink driving limit, we think, will add to that, although we would wish to consider going further with regard to a variety of other road traffic matters. But I think Mr MacDonald makes a valid matter. This is a cultural matter. We do know that there are two particular categories of drink drivers who are causing us problems at the moment. One is a hardcore of recidivists who seem to think that the law does not apply to them. We would have preferred to have had random stop and search powers devolved to us from the UK Government, but that wasn't given. But equally, recidivists have to realise the law applies to them. They will be addressed by the police and they will face the severe consequences that follow. Equally, we do require to try and caution young drivers to recognise that perhaps some of the effects upon those of my own generation, when advertising and a whole variety of other matters brought it to our attention and saw cultural change, is perhaps diminishing. We require to work with all agencies, fire and rescue, police, educational authorities, not only to make sure that we enforce the law, have an appropriate law, but that we change a culture and remind young drivers that driving under the influence of alcohol is likely to cost their lives and the lives of others.
Question number 4, Sandra White.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its priorities are for the next tranche of funding from the Cashback for Communities programme.
Cabinet Secretary.
The priority for our highly successful Cashback for Communities programme is to invest the proceeds of crime back into communities to benefit all Scotland's young people. Since its inception, over £46 million has been invested throughout Scotland, directly benefiting over 600,000 young people and generating over 11,000 young person volunteers who are now putting something back into their communities. All cashback funding received through proceeds of crime has already been invested or is committed in projects for young people in their communities hit by crime through to 2014-15. This includes almost £27 million on sporting activities and facilities projects, £8.5 million on grant schemes that support small, diversionary youth work projects throughout the country, over £3.5 million on cultural activities including arts, music and dance, and £2.25 million on a community assets programme which aims to help support communities to find solutions to their own problems.
Sandra White.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply. It's really excellent news to see that this initiative is benefiting so many young people and communities. However, can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that the amounts raised under the Proceeds of Crime Act are still capped, with any excess going to the London Treasury, something which I think everyone will find simply unacceptable and outrageous? And does he believe that we can achieve cross-party consensus here in the Parliament to pressurise the UK Government on this issue and to ensure that any monies taken from criminals here in Scotland benefits the communities that they have blighted?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would hope that. I know that it's an issue that's been raised before. Indeed, I think it's not just Sandra White that has raised this, but I remember Lord George Foulkes, as the First Minister refers to him, raising this matter, and I agree with them on that. The proceeds of crime are currently capped at £30 million, with all other matters being remitted to Treasury. Whilst we have not breached that, the endeavours of the Lord Advocate and his colleagues, I think, are having us head towards a situation where that may be possible or may occur at some time in the future. And it seems to me that it is appropriate that proceeds of crime recovered by the authorities in this country should be returned to our communities. And I would hope that members all across the chamber would agree that this is matters that should be dealt with here, that there shouldn't be any cap at all, and the money should certainly not be going to the Treasury when it can be reinvested to improve and secure our communities.
Tricia Ferguson.
The Cabinet Secretary knows of my concern that those communities most blighted by crime should receive a proportionate amount of money in return from the cashback scheme. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary could detail to the Chamber today how the Scottish Government measures that that is indeed the case and what action they will take to ensure that it is, if that is not currently happening.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we do try to make sure that we provide extra to those areas that require most. I would say that those areas that are suffering from the problems and blight of crime, we put matters back into. Equally, we also accept a rural divide because, for example, the cost of providing some facilities to allow kids to participate, whether it's in art, dance or football, can be greater in rural areas where you're required to pay for buses. So what we take into account are a variety of factors. Those areas that suffer disproportionately should be rewarded, and we do that. Those areas that have a problem with rural peripherality also have to be supported, because I'm happy to give you an assurance that we do provide for those areas that suffer disproportionately. Equally, I would make it quite clear that there will be no postcode lottery, because it does appear to me that every child should be given the opportunity to be all they can be, irrespective of where they reside.
Question number 5, Jim Eadie.
To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on the introduction of legislation to allow for the prosecution of crimes of aggression under international law.
Cabinet Secretary.
Our position is that action to introduce the crime of aggression into Scots criminal law is at this time is likely to fall out with the competence of the Parliament by virtue of the Foreign Relations reservations of the Scotland Act. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court is the treaty that established the International Criminal Court. Following the agreement reached at the Kampala Conference in 2010, Member States who are party to the treaty, including the UK Government, have until 2017 to decide whether to ratify the amendments agreed at Kampala in relation to the crime of aggression. We understand the UK Government have not yet reached a decision on what they will do. Until such time as we know whether the UK Government are going to ratify the Rome Statute amendment relating to crimes of aggression, action to legislate would fall out with the competence of the Scottish Parliament.
Jim Eadie.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. While acknowledging the possible barriers to incorporating the crime of aggression into Scots law, does he agree with me that as a matter of fundamental principle, this Government and this Parliament should be doing everything in their power to support the rule of international criminal law and the bringing to trial of those accused of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes and indeed the crime of aggression, regardless of who they are and any official status they have attained?
Cabinet Secretary.
Absolutely. No one who perpetrates those heinous offences, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes or whatever, should not be able to be brought to account. So we are clear as a government that we support empowering the International Criminal Court to bring justice to those actively involved in the planning, preparation, initiation and execution of illegal wars, whoever they are and whatever the position they may hold. So I do hope that the UK Government will listen to the views offered here in the Scottish Parliament in terms of the strength of feeling on this issue. It will support the ratification of the amendments to the treaty, and the Scottish Government will then be in a position to act.
Question number 6, Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what it is doing to tackle domestic abuse.
Cabinet Secretary.
The Scottish Government continues to work with key partners, including COSLA, ACPOS and the voluntary organisations to tackle domestic abuse. We've allocated £34.5 million funding over the next 3 years to tackle violence against women, including domestic abuse, and this funding demonstrates strong commitment to this area at a time of unprecedented financial constraint. It enables us to support a wide variety of projects and organisations like Scottish Women's Aid, which focus on supporting victims. We also support the Caledonian system, which addresses men's offending behaviour.
Maureen Watt.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Will the Cabinet Secretary join with me in congratulating Grampian Police's Domestic Abuse Unit in giving people who are victims of domestic abuse and who continue to be at risk protected adult status, which allows them direct access to police help? And does he believe that the legal profession should be aware of this status in related criminal and civil cases?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, absolutely. I do believe that the legal profession should be aware of that. I am aware of the outstanding work being done by Grampian Police's Domestic Abuse Unit, and I pay tribute to them. Equally, I am always minded by John Carnahan from the Violence Reduction Unit, which is to remind us that violence against women is a men's issue. We require to provide for and support those who are victims, but fundamentally we have to change a culture of violence and an attitude amongst men that seems to think that this is fair game or whatever. So whether it's Grampian Police, whether it's John Carnahan in the Violence Reduction Unit, the legal profession or whoever, we all have a role as parliamentarians and indeed citizens, and those of us who are male have a particular role to make sure that we address it. That was not simply in domestic abuse, but it's been driven home in the recent campaign that's been launched to tackle sexual offences and indeed the crime of rape that the Lord Advocate, myself, Sandy Brindley from Rape Crisis Scotland and indeed police were participating in.
Briefly, Lewis MacDonald.
I echo the comments about Grampian Police's domestic abuse service. Can the Cabinet Secretary comment on the fact that in the 9% increase in domestic abuse figures across Scotland last week, the biggest increase was in the area of Northern Constabulary? And does he agree that the Domestic Abuse Court, which has been so successful in Glasgow, should play a role in addressing this issue in other parts of Scotland too?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, this is an issue that's been canvassed on many occasions within this chamber. I think the work done by the Domestic Abuse Court in Glasgow is outstanding. Equally, the initiative that has taken place in the City of Edinburgh is also outstanding. There are difficulties in some areas because I've mentioned before in this community to set up a domestic abuse court in Lochmaddy is simply not credible, nor indeed would it likely be the situation in Stornoway, Lerwick or other matters. So there is a significant cause for concern in terms of matters being addressed in Northern. Equally, I'm sure that police and courts are on matters there, and as I say, what we seek to do is to work with courts, work with the legal profession, work with the judiciary to make sure that we tackle and address this.
I'm afraid I must now ask for brevity in questions and answers. Question number 7, John Finney.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government, in light of the recent 10-day enforcement period on the A9 Inverness-Perth Road, where 687 motorists were charged with speeding offences, whether it plans to repeat the exercise.
Cabinet Secretary.
The decision to conduct and coordinate such activities is part of operational police planning and subject to a number of variable factors. No specific plans have been announced to repeat this joint high-profile enforcement initiative, but I can give the member an assurance that if the Chief Constable or the Divisional Commander or whomsoever decides in conjunction with VOSA or whatever to do so, they'll have my full support.
John Finney.
Cabinet Secretary for that response, and I wonder, in light of the level of fatal road collisions on the A9, whether the Scottish Government will consider installing average detection speed cameras.
Cabinet Secretary.
The outcome of the A9 Safety Group, which met on 25th July, was to consider a series of actions. One of these is for the A9 Safety Group to investigate the case for an average speed system between Dunblane and Inverness, and it may be that the member would wish to communicate with them.
Question number 8, Annabel Ewing.
Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what undertakings it has received from the UK Government to meet any increased demand on the Scottish civil legal aid budget as a result of UK welfare reform.
Cabinet Secretary.
The UK Government has not provided concrete assurances to meet any monetary impact as a result of increased demand on the civil legal aid budget through welfare reform. We are continuing to seek clarity on this issue, most recently through the Joint Ministerial Committee and regular discussions with DWP ministers.
Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer. And it is, of course, disappointing but not surprising to hear that the UK Government at this point plan to do absolutely nothing to meet any potential increased demand on the civil legal aid budget as a result of their dismantling of the welfare system. I would therefore put it to the Cabinet Secretary that surely he must recognise that the only way that we can end this ongoing dilemma of reserved policies impacting on what are clearly devolved matters, surely the only way to end this dilemma, Cabinet Secretary, would be to vote yes in the 2014 referendum on independence.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, yes, we have problems here. It would be much better that we are able to provide the solutions.
Question number 9, Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to ensure that court attendance by police officers does not affect frontline policing in their own areas.
Lord Advocate Frank Mulholland.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The evidence which police officers give in court is often necessary to secure criminal convictions, and police officers are also required to execute orders of the court and apprehend those who fail to appear. The Crown will always take measures to avoid the unnecessary attendance of witnesses at court, including agreeing evidence where possible and scheduling cases to cause the least inconvenience and disruption to police officers as possible. For those police witnesses cited, The Procurator Fiscal Service have also put in place police witness scheduler and standby arrangements that allow police officers who have been cited for court to carry out their duties whilst waiting to be called to give evidence.
Bill Kidd.
Thank the Lord Advocate for that reply. Can I just ask him if he agrees with me that allowing officers to continue in their own patrol areas in Glasgow around an hour before court time would be efficient, as nowhere in Glasgow is more than an hour from the city courts?
Frank Mulholland.
I agree with the principle made by the member. I could quote the results of the standby arrangements at Glasgow Sheriff Court since March of this year. Over 2,000 police officers have been placed on standby arrangements, which allows those police officers on such arrangement to carry out other police duties whilst they're waiting to give evidence in court. But I should also point out that the police officers do have a duty to give evidence in court as and when required. And what we need to do is to have flexible arrangements to ensure that there is not a huge imposition on the policing of Glasgow itself, whilst ensuring that police officers are available to give evidence at the time required.
We must now move on to questions on rural affairs and the environment. Question number 1, Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Cabinet Secretary what actions the Scottish Government is taking to support egg producers.
Cabinet Secretary Richard Lockhead.
The Scottish Government has provided support to egg producers through the Scotland Rural Development Programme, including through the Food Processing, Marketing and Cooperation Grant Scheme. The latest rounds announced on Sunday the 16th of September include a grant for almost £500,000 to egg producers AJ Duncan and Turriff for building upgrades and purchase of grading, packing and other equipment.
Joan McAlpine.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that eggs produced in Scotland are produced to higher welfare standards than other parts of the UK, and we have our own SEO country identifier on each egg. What can the Scottish Government do to help promote this fact in supermarkets?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think Joan McAlpine raises a good point. It's certainly the case that Scotland does meet some of the highest animal welfare standards in the whole of the world, and it's something we should perhaps shout about more. And we've seen the pig industry doing that with some success in conjunction with the RSPCA in recent times. So I think there's an opportunity here. I know there are a number of organisations are speaking about making the most of that, and I'll happily give it some more thought and update the member.
Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Taking things from a slightly different perspective, Cabinet Secretary, given the success of the UK-wide campaigns such as SOS Dairy Campaign, and I know that you were at Lanark at that important meeting there, what will the Cabinet Secretary do to work alongside colleagues in the UK Government and other devolved administrations and appropriate organisations to see a fair price is paid to free-range egg producers?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'll do anything it takes to ensure that our primary producers in Scotland do receive a fair price, and hopefully the Scottish Government demonstrated its commitment during the recent dairy crisis when our dairy farmers quite rightly were shouting about the fact that they were getting a very raw deal in terms of their share of every pound that's spent in milk and in the supermarkets and elsewhere. And if indeed that applies to other products, I'd be right behind any campaign to make sure there's fair trade for Scottish producers. If there's any evidence that that's not the case at the moment, I'm certainly wanting to hear that.
Question number 2, Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with Falkirk Council and other agencies regarding the fly infestation at Abbotscench and Grangemouth.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
Regulation of waste facilities such as the Abbotscench Recycling Centre is a matter for SEPA. SEPA and the Scottish Government have had contact with Grangemouth Community Council about nuisance caused by flies believed to be coming from the recycling centre. SEPA has taken enforcement action to ensure the operator, to require the operator to improve the controls at the site, and I understand the site is now operating in compliance with its licence and the number of flies is expected to reduce.
Claire Adamson.
Can I thank the Minister for that very detailed response? There is no doubt that this matter is some concern to the local residents whose enjoyment of their houses and gardens has been blighted by this infestation. Can I commend the work of my colleague Angus MacDonald, the constituency MSP, who has established a problem-solving partnership with local residents and stakeholders? And will the Minister undertake to keep the partnership fully informed of developments regarding this infestation?
Minister.
Indeed, I commend both Angus MacDonald and SEPA for their proactive engagement with local residents and other stakeholders on this issue and other similar issues in the local area. I wholeheartedly encourage this productive engagement to continue in pursuit of an outcome satisfactory to all, and I will look forward to hearing further outcomes of this partnership working in due course.
Question number 3, Ian Gray.
To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of the impact on the arable sector of recent weather conditions.
Cabinet Secretary.
This year's weather conditions have been challenging for some Scottish farmers in the arable sector in particular, due to localised flooding resulting in some crop losses. Overall yields are lower in many cases, with reports suggesting a reduction of 10 to 20%. However, cereal prices are up by around 20% on last year. We will, however, have a clearer picture of the financial and market effects on this year's crops following our annual crop reporting meeting, which will take place with key stakeholders on the 8th of October, and we will publish yield estimates shortly thereafter.
Ian Gray.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his reply, and I know that he has today agreed to visit East Lothian Produce, in my constituency, Scotland's main producer of cabbage and a significant supplier of potatoes too, and that's very welcome and very much to his credit, his willingness to come and see what's happening. But he will find, when he goes there, that this company is facing losses of as much as 40% in their key crops because of the exceptional rainfall. What arable farmers really need to know is will he be able to offer any support or succour for those suffering these difficult circumstances?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for his supplementary and the constructive way in which he presented it, and I thank him for bringing to my attention the circumstances facing East Lothian Produce. I'm very sorry to hear about them, and that's why I am very keen to meet them first hand to hear about their experiences, and I hope the member is able to make it along to that meeting. Clearly, there is not and has never been financial compensation provided by governments to industries in this country for the impact of severe weather conditions. However, if there are other ways in which we could help the industry, we're very keen to hear about that, and we will do all we can. And we do recognise the very challenging circumstances facing many businesses, and of course potato growers in Scotland in particular at the moment are facing difficulties, as well as vegetable growers such as East Lothian Produce. So I very much look forward to the meeting and hearing any constructive ideas where the government may be able to help.
Jamie McGregor.
Thank you. Is there any support that ministers can give to livestock producers, including pig producers, who are facing large increases in the cost of the feedstuffs, partly as a result of what we've heard?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, firstly, we are doing our utmost to promote the consumption of Scottish food produce in this country and beyond, because if more and more people could enjoy fantastic Scottish pork and other products, that will certainly be the best way in which to help producers. And I know that's something that all members of this chamber have been supporting, particularly given that at the weekend Scottish Food and Drink Fortnight drew to an end, when we were making a particular effort to promote Scottish food and drink. I am in regular contact with pig producers in Scotland over a range of issues at the moment, and we are discussing some initiatives that may be of assistance in the future. But clearly it's too early to see what will be the best ones in light of rising feed prices, which is a global issue, not particularly a Scottish issue, and affecting producers everywhere.
Question number 4, Jenny Mara.
To ask the Scottish Government how it will use the findings of the report on proposals and policies to implement its climate change policy.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
In March 2011, the Scottish Government published Low Carbon Scotland, Meeting the Emission Reduction Targets 2010-2022. The statutory report on proposals and policies, or RPP, which set the strategic direction to take us to our 42% emissions reduction target for 2020. Subsequently, in October 2011, a second batch of annual targets for 2023-27 was set. We're currently working on a second RPP, which will consider how these targets can be achieved, and this report will also assess the progress made towards implementing the measures contained in the first RPP. Ministers may make adjustments to those measures if they consider it appropriate to do so.
Jenny Mara.
I thank the Minister for his answer. Has the Scottish Government considered the recommendation by the Rural Affairs Committee to ensure the forthcoming RPP is aligned with the Scottish budget?
Minister.
We are certainly working on the revised RPP, and in terms I'm aware there are issues to do with the timing of the report, but what I would say in terms of that, we're aiming to lay the report before the end of the year. But it's a complex, wide-ranging project, and work is ongoing to ensure the final report is sufficiently robust to remain relevant for at least the next 5 years, at which time we'll need to introduce RPP3. But if there are any specific issues that the member wishes to raise with me, I'll be more than happy to meet with her.
Briefly, Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. Clearly, the RPP will only actually be of any use if it is fully funded in the Scottish Government's budgets. Will the Minister ensure that parliamentary committees have adequate time to consider those two documents together, as he recommended when he signed off the recommendations of last year's Finance Committee report on that year's budget?
Minister.
Thank you. I thank the member for his question. As he is well aware, I obviously was in the Finance Committee and recognise the comments he made. We have to wait, obviously, for John Swinney, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance's revised budget, and hopefully, once we have that, then we can engage in more dialogue on the issues he raises.
Question number 5, Graham Pearson.
To ask the Scottish Government, in light of its not meeting its climate change target, how it plans to ensure that subsequent targets are achieved.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
As I refer to the answer I gave to his colleague Jenny Mara, the member will be aware that we, as a government, have already achieved almost 2/3 of the way, or slightly over half the way, towards our initial target of 42% reduction. We have obviously, like all members, I am disappointed with the outcome of the 2010 performance in terms of emissions reduction target. And as Stuart Stevenson explained when the data was first published in July, a significant factor in this was extreme cold weather at the start and end of 2010, which resulted in an additional 2.2 million tonnes of carbon dioxide being emitted as a result of residential heating. The Scottish Government remains fully committed to delivering the emission cuts needed to meet our ambitious and world-leading climate change targets. And last year's spending review contained details of more than £650 million in climate change spending. We've been able to announce a further £34 million additional funding this year. And as I mentioned to Patrick Harvey, we await the revised budget from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance this year. We'll seek to secure additional money for climate change purposes whenever there are opportunities to do so. However, this is not just about central government money. Action throughout the wider public sector, investment from the private sector and steps taken, importantly, by households and individuals will be an important part in meeting our emissions targets.
Graham Pearson.
I'm grateful to the Minister for that answer. And given the acknowledgement of his predecessor, Stuart Stevenson's comment in regard to the cold weather conditions in 2010, will he expect that he wishes for better weather in the coming winters to go alongside his warm words and commitment?
Minister.
Indeed, we certainly indications for 2011 from UK data, which have yet to feed out. There has been a 25% reduction in household consumption of or production of CO2 through gas consumption. But importantly, I think for members, it's opposite to recognise that if we were to have a more favourable budget from the Westminster Government, we could achieve far more in terms of addressing our carbon reduction targets.
Question number 6, John Park.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what recent engagement it has had with key organisations in the agricultural sector.
Cabinet Secretary.
The Scottish Government has an intensive and ongoing engagement programme with key agricultural organisations across a wide range of policy areas.
John Park.
Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary specifically about engagement he's had with organisations regarding employment in the agricultural sector? I know the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have done a bit of work in this area, and that the Scottish Government have been looking at certain work around the Agriculture's Wages Board. And also Citizens Advice Bureau in Perth have raised concerns with me with regards to some employment issues that have come up over the summer. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if this is something that's on his radar and what steps the Scottish Government have been taking to address these issues?
Cabinet Secretary.
Remember, it's certainly something that's on the Government's radar, and indeed only last week the Scottish Government hosted a new entrant summit for the agricultural sector, where a range of ideas came forward from the thankfully quite young new entrants who were at that summit and who want to build a career in agriculture, and I'll certainly be taking some of these initiatives forward. I can also tell the Chamber and indeed the member, given he raises this subject, that Angela Constance, the Youth Employment Minister, and myself are hoping to host a Rural Skills Summit soon as well, because we recognise there's a demand amongst many rural sectors to attract more people into them in the next generation, and we want to discuss what the gaps are in terms of skills, so we can encourage more young people, more apprentices, etc., to hopefully build a career in our rural sectors.
Jean Urquhart.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what recent engagement it has had with key organisations in the crofting sector.
Cabinet Secretary.
We've had a range of engagements and discussed a whole range of issues.
Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the discussions that the Cabinet Secretary has had, is he aware of the growing concern over the manner in which the eligible land penalties are applying to crofters and farmers? Is he aware that 23 more crofters and farmers in Shetland will be inspected this year, and 1,000 more units across the whole of Scotland are part of his department's work in this area? Does he recognise that the European Union have not changed the underlying basis for that regime, but his department have changed the way in which those inspections are done between 2008 and 2012? And will he undertake to look into that and see if there's any way whatsoever in which that regime could be made fairer, as most crofters and farmers think that the current mechanisms by which they're being penalised are grotesquely unfair?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks. I recognise the member raises an issue which is of concern to many farmers and crofters in Scotland, and he will be aware, of course, that due to disallowance from the European Union, which we had to pay just recently several tens of millions of pounds, that the auditors were looking for a more stringent application of the regulations in Scotland to ensure that money from the public purse has been spent correctly. Therefore, I think it's unfair to simply lay this at the door of Scottish officials. We're doing this because it's in the wider interest of Scotland and indeed the farmers themselves to ensure there's future payments. But in terms of the current Common Agricultural Policy negotiations, where I do agree with the sentiment of what he's saying is that we are disappointed there's not more coming from the Commission in terms of changing the cross-compliance regime and the penalties regime in particular, which we think is a sledgehammer to crack a nut in many cases, and we're still making that case to the Commission to make it more proportionate and reasonable.
Question number 7, Gil Patterson.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what support it gives to local authorities to ensure that recycling targets are met.
Cabinet Secretary.
Continuing to help local authorities meet recycling targets is a priority for both myself and Zero Waste Scotland. That is why we announced at the last budget that we would invest almost £80 million over the next 3 years in an effort to reduce waste and recycle more. And this year, Zero Waste Scotland is making £5 million available to local authorities to help them roll out household food waste collections. And funding is also available to help councils roll out recycling services to tenements for recycling on the go, communication engagement work, service improvements and staff training.
Gil Patterson.
I thank the Minister for that answer. In my constituency, a number of residents who live in high-rise flats have particular problems with regards to provision of recycling bins at home. Can the Government assist local authorities with sharing ideas that would allow the best practice across local authorities in Scotland in regards to provision of recycling bins, so that those residents who live in high-rise flats can manage the number of bins that are required?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks. I mean, the question, of course, from the member does raise a very important issue, which is different local authorities in different parts of Scotland face different challenges when it comes to rolling out curbside recycling. And as Gil Patterson quite rightly points out, tenements in particular face some challenges in Glasgow, and other local authorities have been trying new innovative methods in recent years. I can advise, however, we will shortly be publishing curbside best practice guidance that will provide councils with detailed information and best practice from across the country on the design, implementation and delivery of waste services, including, of course, to flats and tenements. So it's a very important area that we recognise we have to roll out across Scotland.
Question number 8, Malcolm Chisholm.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it and its agencies will take to address the environmental issues at the Seafield wastewater treatment works.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
In line with the relevant code of practice, it's a matter for regulators to ensure that effective arrangements are in place to minimise the emission of malodor from Seafield wastewater treatment works, and I recognise the members' long interest in this issue. SEPA is the regulator for the waste handling parts of the site, and the City of Edinburgh Council is the regulator for all remaining parts. Scottish Water is committed to working closely with both regulators.
Malcolm Chisholm.
Aware that in spite of some investment by Scottish Water at Seafield, there are still frequent odour emissions that are completely unacceptable to the local community. Is he further aware that the Council's Environment Committee resolved at its meeting last week to make representations to Scottish Water for investment and action to deal with these continuing problems? Will the Minister also raise this matter with Scottish Water, as I will do at a meeting this Friday?
Paul Wheelhouse.
Thank the member. In terms of the issue about the investment, we've already invested £20 million in the 2006 to 2010 regulatory period to tackle malodour at Seafield. Any further investment will need to be proposed by the relevant regulators, clearly based on evidence, and be a proportionate response to the problem identified. That's not to diminish the issue the member raises. I recognise it's a serious problem and has been for some 10 years. But I'd be more than happy to meet with the member following his meeting that he mentioned with Mr McCaskill and Scottish Water and himself.
Thank you very much. That concludes question time, and the next item of business is a debate on motion number 4165 in the name of Elaine Murray on rail. I will allow a few seconds for members to change places.